Hi folks, so let's talk analysis of the yellow wallpaper. So if you haven't completed your video notes over the cultural and historical context, I highly recommend that you do so before we get into this analysis, because this story in particular has such a complex set of historical and cultural factors at work here that it's difficult to really get a good read on it without that information. So if you need to go do that, do it and come back. So in this story, this is part of our unreliable narrator Gothic unit, and of course we have an unreliable narrator in Jane, that's the narrator's name. That can be a little confusing. Now, how reliable is Jane in the story? Well, this is a complicated question, because how reliable you interpret Jane to be in the story really depends on what part of the story that we're talking about. Now, in the beginning of the story, Jane seems to be pretty coherent, pretty rational. She seems to understand things to a certain extent around her, and she seems to be fairly articulate. And then as the story progresses, her reliability and her increasing madness seems to sort of compound over and over to build up to this narrator who is almost wholly unreliable. However, I do think it's important to point out that just because Jane is unreliable doesn't mean she's lying, right? At no point are we given reason to believe that Jane does not 100% believe that what she sees and what she thinks is happening is real, right? But because her mental state is deteriorating, that calls the reliability of her telling the story into question. Now, early on in the story, we get some indication that Jane is educated, or that Jane is somewhat of a more resourceful or more intellectually interested woman. Now, during this period of time, remember that the beliefs about mental health had a lot to do with social expectations about gender. And it was believed that women who wanted to participate in these sorts of intellectual activities would overtax their brain and fry their nerves, and that this would make them hysterical. So we know this about Jane, and we also know that she has been forbidden from writing, right? John, her husband and physician, has told her that she shouldn't write, and this goes back to that historical expectation about her capacity to do so as a woman. But she seems to be aware that, or she seems to know that if she were able to do those things, that she may feel a little bit better. She says at one point in the story, early on, she says, "I sometimes fancy that in my condition, if I had less opposition and more society and stimulus, but John says the very worst thing I can do is think about my condition, and I confess it always makes me feel bad, so I will let it alone and talk about the house." So Jane seems to have some sort of implication that I feel like if I was just able to do some of these things, that I would start to feel better. If I wasn't opposed every time I sort of wanted to do something that I wanted, then maybe I would feel a little bit better. But you notice that Jane sort of doesn't even get that idea out before she says, "But this is what John says to do, and so I'm just going to do what John says." Now, this is why it's so important to distinguish between between Charlotte Perkins Gilman's experience as the author and the narrator's experience in the story. This is a fictionalized account, meaning this is not CPG's own thoughts and experiences. And the most significant difference between CPG and Jane is that Jane accepts it. She doesn't question that John or her physician knows better than her about her own condition. She doesn't question whether or not she knows what's best for her. She just accepts it and goes along with it, and that ultimately contributes to what happens to her throughout the story. We also know that Jane seems to be sort of resistant to these roles of a domestic, a domestic person who is primarily a wife and mother without any sort of ambition. She says later in the story, "Personally, I believe that congenial work with excitement and change would do me good." So again, showing awareness that she, thinks that she'd feel better if she were, able to escape this rest cure. But then we have Jenny. Jenny is a foil character to Jane in that she is her opposite. She contrasts with our protagonist. And this is how Jane describes Jenny. She is a perfect and enthusiastic housekeeper and hopes for no better profession. Now, Charlotte Perkins Gilman was known for a lot of things in her lifetime as an activist and political thinker. But one of the things that she most famously said, and I'm paraphrasing here, is that not only are you expected to be domestic and submissive, but you're also expected to be really happy and content with that. And I think that this, you can really see the difference here in Jenny. So it's not only that Jenny is doing what society expects her to do, but she's happy about it. And arguably, part of the reason that Jane feels bad every time she thinks about her condition or thinks about what she's, her state, is that Jane maybe doesn't understand why she can't be happy with that, why that's not enough for her. Now, we know, of course, today that Jane is suffering from postpartum depression. This is also what Charlotte Perkins Gilman suffered from. However, Charlotte Perkins Gilman would never hear those words in her lifetime, and neither would Jane. It's really important to understand that postpartum depression was not listed as an official medical diagnosis until the 80s. This was the 1980s, so, 100 years later. This was not something that people knew about in their lifetime. So, although we know that the narrator is suffering from a legitimate, chemical imbalance because of her postpartum state, the narrator doesn't know this, and neither does the author of the story. So that's something to keep in mind as you're sort of interpreting the role of her own, mental condition within the story and within the cultural context. Now, as the story goes on, her narration starts to change. She starts off with these big sort of complete, articulate, descriptive paragraphs, and then towards the further the story goes on, the more it becomes sort of frantic and cut off, and we get these thoughts that don't even really have, a logical train across them. It's just sort of these paranoid, iterations every couple of lines. And this is a symptom of her increasing illness, but it also calls into question that she's getting more and more unreliable as the story goes on. She's hallucinating, essentially. And we know, psychologically speaking, that it doesn't take long to start hallucinating when people are deprived of sensory stimulation, and that's essentially what's happening. Now, one thing that you want to be cautious of in analyzing this story is the ease with which people are prone to villainize John. John is the bad guy. He's awful in this story, and don't get me wrong, he's not great. But the fact of the matter is, within the cultural and historical context, John is doing exactly what a good doctor would do and exactly what a good physician would do, or exactly what a good husband would do. He doesn't seem to want to wish harm on Jane. He doesn't seem to, want bad things for her. But this is what the leading medical science at the time says is the treatment for her condition. And this is what his role within society and within the institution of marriage says that he should do. He is in charge of making these decisions, and he knows better how to make those decisions. So although John does contribute to those things, in that way, as a person, within the historical context, can we expect him to do anything else? And on the flip side of that, John is really more of a symbolic figure that stands in for all of these cultural factors that are oppressing Jane and that are keeping Jane in this position that's causing so much of her mental trauma. Now, the wallpaper, title of the story, of course the wallpaper is hugely symbolic. So what do you think the wallpaper would be symbolic of? Well, we know that Jane has torn it down. We know that it's become the source of her paranoia, the source of her anxiety about this room. But really, the wallpaper is just the only thing that she's had to manifest her increasingly deteriorating mental state on. And the comparison that I make in terms of modern times is do you ever find yourself somewhere without your phone for a while and, suddenly you're reading the warning label on the back of a bottle of soap or something to entertain yourself? That's essentially the state that she's in. She has nothing to stimulate her brain, so she has created something. Her brain has created this hallucination, this delusion, to stimulate itself. And the wallpaper becomes increasingly more oppressive to her because of that. Now, the most common interpretation of the wallpaper is that it's symbolic for all of these sorts of social structures that are at play here. It's the medical or establishment, the structure of gender in society, the institution of marriage, the all of these sorts of things, and or all of them together is what we can interpret the wallpaper to symbolize. And with that in mind, I want to read to you a specific section of the story that illustrates thematically what the story is doing with that. So Jane says, "Sometimes I think there are a great many women behind, and sometimes only one, and she crawls around fast, and her crawling shakes it all over. Then in the very bright spots she keeps still, and in the very shady spots she just takes hold of the bars and shakes them hard. And she is all the time trying to climb through, but nobody could climb through that pattern. It strangles so. I think that is why it has so many heads." So if you take the symbolic meaning of that wallpaper into account here, what it's saying essentially is that sometimes I feel like I'm the only woman that feels this way about these things, and sometimes I feel like a lot of women do, but you know, sometimes I feel like I can tolerate it, and sometimes I just want to shake the bars on the window because I don't know what to do. And all the time I feel like I'm trying to get through it, but nobody can get through it. It's so because it strangles so. I think that's why there are so many different ways that this is holding me back. And that's, you know, one of the symbolic applications of the wallpaper there. And of course, what the story is getting at is how all of these things are becoming not just, you know, oppressive, but harmful and cruel to, you know, women who find themselves in this position. Now, the ending of the story, as Jane emerges from the room, she says, "I've got out at last in spite of you and Jane." That's what Jane says. So of course this signals that she has gone over a total mental collapse. Like the old Jane is gone. But more specifically, you want to think about why would she say in spite of you and Jane? What was the old Jane doing to keep her in there? And one interpretation of how that works in the story is that this story is critiquing not only these establishments, but it's critiquing the women in these establishments who abide it, who go along with it, who are complicit in their own sort of victimization by these systems. Because if Jane had, you know, done something about the way that she felt, well, then this, you know, new version of this sort of, you know, mentally broken version of the narrator wouldn't have had a chance to emerge, which is what happened to CPG. You know, she knew what was happening and she got out. And so some interpret this to be a little bit of exposing how, you know, just participating in all of this is sort of keeping these systems in place for all. Now, the last thing that I will point out, and there are so many more things, but just for this video's sake, the last thing that I want to talk about is the resolution in the story. So Jane emerges from the room and John faints. That's what happens. But Jane has become so unreliable that this is probably the least reliable she is in the entire story. We cannot trust anything that, you know, she's hallucinating. So we can't trust anything that she thinks has happened. So one interpretation of that ending is literal. She walks out and John faints. Well, you know, it would be odd for this to be the one time that she's sort of coherently able to articulate her experience, given all the things that she's been doing previous to this. Other interpretations. She does talk a lot about a rope prior to this. And some interpret that what is happening is that Jane has taken her own life and that she is hallucinating at the end of her life. You know, John finding her and, you know, that situation. And that's a possibility. That's a valid interpretation. Another interpretation is that John did not faint. If you notice in the last lines of the story, Jane says, "I had to crawl over him every time." Now, why would she have to crawl over him every time if he's just fainted? Right? So one interpretation is that Jane has actually killed John, and that's how she has escaped from this room. And she just says that he has fainted because she is hallucinating and lost her mind. Now, which of those interpretations is accurate? It's not for me to say. I mean, there's many reasons for each one of them, but something that I will offer you in considering this final conclusion of the story is maybe the fact that we can't tell is the point. Now, could Charlotte Perkins Gilman write a story where a woman outright murders her husband at the end? Probably not in the 19th century. Could she write a story where a woman outright takes her own life at the end? Probably not in the 19th century. The story was controversial enough as it was. But the fact that she leaves those things open to us to consider might be the strategic point that it is that she's trying to make. I look forward to seeing what you all think about this story in Socratic Seminar.